I'm Catherine Herridge. I'm the Chief Intelligence Correspondent at Fox News. I've been at Fox News since 1996. I began my career with Fox in London before going to New York and then Washington. I cover Homeland Security, the Justice Department, and the U.S. intelligence community. Prior to that, I worked for ABC News in London as a reporter and correspondent. I'd like to thank the Foundation for the honor of moderating the panel this morning. And I'd also like to thank the panelists for the honor of leading the discussion today. Many of these people are very familiar to you, but I'm just going to run down the list here from my right. We begin with Ambassador Michael Gfoeller. He served 26 years as a U.S. diplomat, including stints in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Iraq, and Russia. From 2008 to 2010, he was the senior political advisor to General David Petraeus, then commander of U.S. Central Command, focusing on counterterrorism, international security, and diplomacy. Next to the ambassador is Ali Tubah. He serves as the managing director at McLarty Associates, where he focuses on the Middle East. He previously served as associate director for cabinet affairs in the George W. Bush White House. Next, Ghaith al-Omari is the executive director at the American Task Force on Palestine. Prior to that, he served in various positions within the Palestinian Authority, including advisor to then Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas. And finally, you all know John Hannah as well. John Hannah is a former advisor to Secretaries of State James Baker and Warren Christopher, National Security Advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney, and a senior fellow at the Foundation. Our topic this morning is America's enduring alliances in the Middle East. And to bottom line it for you, the question is whether these alliances are getting stronger, more robust, or if they're getting weaker, and if that is in fact a reflection of U.S. policy in the region. I've had the benefit of talking to the panelists in advance, and it seemed that the areas they wished to focus on really dropped into about 3 or 4 buckets for discussion. One is the Iranian nuclear talks, second, Syria, third, Egypt, and then the fourth, looking to the future. The game plan this morning is that we're going to have 30 minutes of the panel, and then we're going to open it up for your questions. I want to begin with Iran because this seemed to be the topic that concerned the panelists most. Specifically, whether U.S. engagement with Iran on the nuclear issue is strengthening or weakening our existing relationships in the region, and whether this is having, if you will, a ripple or a spin-off effect to these traditional alliances. I'd like to begin with Ambassador Gfoeller. You said to me that this engagement with Iran has, in some ways, almost cast out the old order and created a sense of panic with our traditional allies. Just begin by explaining that for us.
Well, and I was, am I audible? I guess.
Just tap it. It usually comes back.
All right.
Okay.
Yes, there's a great deal of concern in the Persian Gulf right now among the Arab states there that have traditionally been allied with the United States. I mean Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in particular, but the same can be said, I think, to varying degrees about Bahrain and Kuwait. Qatar is a separate case because of its deep economic relationship with Iran, and Oman always goes its own course, of course. But speaking about the kingdom, Saudi Arabia, where I've spent many years and have some idea, at least, of what's going on, there's deep concern because the assumption among the Saudi political elite seems to be that Iran will emerge in the near and medium term as a nuclear power. In other words, they have no faith that the current negotiations will prevent this from happening. And so they're asking themselves how best to adapt to this new future. And I've been hearing this for years from my Saudi contacts, but most vociferously in my recent trip there about a month ago. At the time, people were telling me, look, we're not going to permit a situation to arise where there is only one nuclear power in the Gulf, and it's Iran. So you should expect us to move in that direction, and we may not be the only one. So the consensus view I encountered was that if Iran does succeed in weaponizing its nuclear program at some point, then there will be an arms race in the Gulf.
Okay, John, I'd like to bring you in. You had said to me that the element of the negotiations being secret, in effect, behind the backs of our traditional allies. What was the impact on those relationships?
Yeah, well, I think there's deep worry just about the negotiations and whether or not we're going to get to a really bad deal here. I would say that was going to be the case no matter what, that any kind of U.S. rapprochement with the Iranians was going to make these countries very, very nervous and lead them to probably begin to engage in some very counterproductive behavior, at least as far as the United States was concerned. But I think what made it worse is that the administration has done just, I think you have to say, an awful job of the most basic kind of alliance management criteria that you need to satisfy as an American superpower. Alliances are a critical pillar of American power around the world, in the Middle East in particular. And for us to have spent what appears to be 8 months negotiating in secret an agreement with the worst enemy of all of our friends in the region, something that touches that is truly an existential issue for them, and to then have them be confronted literally within a matter of days with a deal in Geneva that was going to grant the Iranians permanent capability to enrich uranium, was going to, in effect, not roll back their nuclear program, and creates a sunset clause, which at some point in the not-too-distant future will allow Iran to become a full-blown industrial-scale nuclear power on a par with Japan. I think just shattered whatever and this came on top of course, all the things we talked about this morning regarding the Syria red line, in which these powers were also confronted literally overnight with an American decision not to enforce the red line. So the Iranian negotiations being presented to them on top of that after those 8 months of secret negotiations as a fait accompli, I think was entirely destructive and at least in that level, an entirely self-inflicted wound by the United States. It could have been handled much, much better, even though the damage would have been significant no matter what.
I just want to stop you right there. I want to bring in Ali. You've worked inside of an administration. Is this the approach that you would have taken with Iran? And what I'm getting at here, is there a way or was there a way to pursue the Iranian objective while at the same time not in effect isolating or alienating our traditional allies?
Sure. I think it helps to kind of lift the frame just a little bit and understand, the view from the Gulf and how they're looking at this, because you have to understand that to figure out exactly what we could have done differently. The United States has been the central organizing principle of the Middle East from a security standpoint for many decades of the post-World War II period. And as a result, our Gulf allies have placed a lot of their eggs in, if not all their eggs, in our basket, in the United States basket. And with that comes a lot of trust, a lot of faith that the United States knows what it's doing. Mm-hmm. But because of a series of, I will say, missteps and mishandlings, some that preceded this administration, some that have come with this administration, and we kind of know the list. As a result, there's this fundamental questioning of, does the United States know what it's doing? Does it have a strategy? Does it have a plan? As long as we are not communicating to our Gulf allies an overarching roadmap, some sense of shared vision of what the Middle East is going to look like in a future state, you find they are deeply unsettled. So on one hand, the challenge is to set that frame. We know that the ultimate objective, many iterations down, is to integrate Iran into the international community, a non-nuclear Iran into the international community. But Iran is a historic competitor to the Gulf states. Have we articulated them a vision of what that's going to look like? We have not done so. Just to kind of finish, that's the overarching. On a much more tactical level, when you don't have that kind of shared vision, that kind of leadership in place, the little things become so much more important. The personal relationships, the making the trips over, the having the consultations, the phone calls coming in a timely manner. Those things become, the importance of those become so much, become incredibly magnified
really.
as a result. So when you also don't do those things at both a high level, strategic level, and at a tactical level, you're going to create the kind of dislocations that we saw.
They want to bring you in because I see you nodding your head in agreement. Is that also your experience? And do you see some of our traditional allies in the region perhaps being more sympathetic to the Israeli position vis-a-vis Iran?
I mean, first of all, just to maybe to kind of touch on a couple of points that were mentioned earlier, I do think one of the problems in our approach to Iran has been that we've reduced the Iranian issue into the nuclear issue, which is really not what it's all about. As Ali mentioned, there's a traditional rivalry between the Gulf states and Iran. There's a sense that the nuclear deal among some of these countries is coming at the expense of their interests. This corresponds to some messaging they've been hearing from some people in the administration, to the extent that Iran is going to become a regional power, deal with it, almost in these exact words. There's a sense that they are abandoned. There's a sense that their interests are not even taken into account. Add to that the fact that there was no management of the relationship. There was no, as you said, Ali, there is no ongoing calls, consultations by people and individuals that the Gulf has been used to dealing with, who the Gulf trusts, who have had a shared long experience with the Gulf. So in that regard, I think there is a lot of tension that could have been avoided. I mean, this is not the first time that we've had differences with Saudi Arabia. In the past, we managed to deal with it in a very quiet way because we had a trusted, ongoing relation. This did not exist. Now, on a positive note,
if I can jump in, is that because they understood what the vision was for the region? Or
partly it's because they trusted the individuals they were working with. Partly they trusted that the U.S. knew and took account of their interests in a specific way. Maybe not a full vision, but they knew that the U.S. at that point was the pillar and the cornerstone of the regional security and strategic architecture. Right now, they feel there's a pullback. As a result, as you mentioned in the question, there is an objective, if you wish, convergence of interest between some of the Gulf states and Israel. Now, this does not translate into an open cooperation, clearly because of the Palestinian issue. And as long as that is not there, it's very hard for the Gulf states to work openly with Israel. Yet we know that there's behind-the-scenes cooperation, and there was, I think, some frustration in the Gulf, not only from the United States, but from Israel as well, in the way that the peace process was managed. There's a sense that had we managed to have some basic breakthrough in that, then we could have had a much more proactive, open cooperation on a joint interest. So right now, with the Gulf and Israel, there's a concern of where the U.S. is going, and there's a concern where Iran is going. And I expect that we will see much more cooperation between them there and also in Washington in terms of how they manage these relationships and how they push their interests forward.
We could stay with Iran, but I want to move to another topic so we can cover a lot of ground. I want to get to Egypt, because one of the things I found striking in my conversation before the panel is that you all remarked on how the U.S. treatment of Hosni Mubarak had a very dramatic effect in the region, especially for the leadership in Saudi Arabia, Ambassador.
Well, there's a sense in Riyadh that the treatment of Mubarak indicates what the treatment of the al-Saud dynasty would be if there were ever serious unrest in Riyadh, that we would let them go. And as a matter of fact, let them fall. Very senior people have told me this in very blunt terms. And the tradition in the kingdom is to be extraordinarily blunt, almost to the point of rudeness, behind closed doors, but never in public. So it's actually very refreshing in some ways to go and ask Saudis questions like this. And I was told, look, you abandoned a number of allies, most notably the Shah, most recently Mubarak, and we believe you'll do the same thing to us if push comes to shove. There's a sense that having seen this huge change in U.S. policy toward Egypt, the kingdom was forced to act boldly, which is something the Saudis prefer never to do if they can avoid it. But there was no option but to act boldly. And so King Abdullah issued his famous statement saying, look, if there is a cut in American military assistance, I will make it up with a $750 billion war chest made up of oil profits generated over the last 7 years or so. They can afford to do this for a long time. And in fact, what I'm hearing is that the current discussions between Russia and Egypt over potentially large arms purchases excuse me, are in fact being undergirded or supported by a Saudi guarantee and an Emirati, UAE guarantee, to foot the bill. The Egyptians certainly don't have $10 billion. But the Emiratis and the Saudis can pay that bill easily. And when one looks at the calendar, the political calendar in Cairo, there have been 4 major Russian military delegations in Cairo in the last 6 weeks. And the most recent one, which was last week, was discussing the possible sale of 24 MiG-35 fighters to Egypt. That sale wouldn't take place until 2016 because the MiG-35, which is the Russian equivalent of the Joint Strike Fighter, isn't in serial production yet. So it's remarkable that the Russians would be talking to Egypt about this sale. And I think it's something that has great political significance. Even more remarkable is the fact that the Saudis, who have great disagreements with the Russians over issues like Syria, would be willing to foot the bill.
John, I want to bring you in on that point. Do you also see what I think the ambassador is suggesting here, that the Russians are taking advantage of what they see as a receding United States, or they see that a vacuum has been created and an opportunity for them to build better relationships with Egypt, for example?
Yeah, I think there's no question. I mean, this is Putin's modus operandi. He sees opportunities. He sees opportunities particularly to undermine the United States around the world. He does have an entirely zero-sum method of thinking about Russia's standing vis-a-vis the United States. So, listen, he's seen an opening to get back into Egypt and to make a lot of money at the same time. The Saudis are willing to foot this bill. If they weren't, I'm much less sure that the Russians would be willing to jump back into Egypt. I don't know how great they see their prospects in Egypt, given how deep and long-standing the U.S. relationship with Egypt, particularly on the military side. But they do see an opportunity to, again, in another forum, to undermine the United States, to weaken the U.S., to poke the United States in the eye, and to trumpet Putin's ability to have Russia reemerge as a major power in a region of the world that people haven't thought about Russia being a major power for the better part of 3 decades. So I think, yes, he's doing it. How far it will go, what does it mean beyond Putin's ability to use this against the United States to undermine us, I don't know. But I think it is a reflection of this change that we've been talking about all morning in a regional order that we've been used to for several decades, that had the United States at the very center of it, and everybody making their national security calculations around the idea that the United States was going to be the dominant power in this region, willing to exercise its significant power in the service of regional peace and stability, to not having that anymore. And that is a world where nobody else is really going to step up. The Russians will play, the Chinese might play, the Saudis might try and get a nuke, the Israelis might decide they've got to bomb Iran themselves. It becomes a very, very dangerous and chaotic world without the United States as the central organizing principle in that region, who's willing to stand up on behalf of an order that we created, and that, for all its faults, has worked reasonably well to protect our interests and to protect, I would argue, the larger Western-minded global community since World War II.
And if I can just build on that, I mean, the primary concern for each of these governments is their own internal stability. That makes sense. And because of the demographic nature of the makeup of many of these countries, because of the fact that they have just different cultural histories, different institutions, different ways of governing, each of them is engaged in this fairly delicate balancing act of trying to identify, where's the balance between stability and progress. And each of them is coming to a different determination, but they're trying to pull off that kind of delicate balancing act. And they feel like the United States has been a partner in that, in that calculation for decades. And what really happened with the fall of Mubarak was they woke up one day and they realized our assumptions are entirely false. We thought we understood about where we were all calibrated, and we don't understand the strategic calculation the United States has made that has caused the president to go up to the podium in the press briefing room and say, Mubarak must go. It must be because, well, this many people took to the streets. Well, what's that number in our own countries? How many people take to the streets in our own country, and then all of a sudden we're going to have the same thing going on for Gulf nation X? That is a question that still hangs over bilateral relations and our relations with the region.
Yeah, I mean, just on this theme, I think, first of all, the Egyptian relation with the U.S.-Egyptian relation is so key to our strategic interests in the region, and it's one that we cannot lose. And the Egyptians do not want to lose it either. They're not eager to do that. Yet we might get, and they don't want to go into the Russian orbit. They know how unpredictable and how untrustworthy the Russians are. But we might get to a point that they will have to make that choice. And this is where I think what we have to avoid. I'm fairly positive that we are shifting in a positive direction right now in the last couple of weeks with the arms sales and what have you. But Congress, by the way, is a problem in this regard these days. So it's not only the administration. But another angle on Egypt is, it's one of perception, but perception is reality in politics there, is the approach to the Muslim Brotherhood. There was a sense in the Gulf states, in the Arab world, in Jordan, elsewhere, that we fell in love in this town with the Muslim Brotherhood. There was a sense that we were so supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. This was reinforced and reaffirmed after the fall of the Muslim Brotherhood with a very strong, almost ideological position that we took on that whole development. This was even further underlined by the strong relations we were developing with Qatar, where HBJ suddenly became the most popular Arab in Washington. So there was a sense that the US has shifted from its traditional allies to this new Muslim Brotherhood wave, and this created a lot of tension in the Arab world. This prompted the Saudis and the Emiratis to declare it a terrorist organization. This also created tension in Jordan, and they were doing their own thing to undermine it. But this was another bit of maybe miscommunication that we could have handled better in terms of the optics, in terms of the management of the relation, in terms of how our diplomats behaved. So all of that created a sense that the US is moving away from that region, is disengaging and leaving it in the hands, not of the traditional allies, but actually in the hands of our traditional adversaries.
We just have 5 minutes left before the questions, and I gather you talked about Syria earlier, so I'm going to just skip over that and go to looking ahead. I'm going to ask each one of you, what do you think it takes, in your opinion, if you agree that the U.S. seems to have pulled back from the region, for the U.S. To reassert its standing or authority? Ambassador, and then I'll go down the line.
Well, I think we need to keep in mind the tremendous value of the traditional alliances we've had in the Gulf for 60 years. I will put the greatest emphasis on two countries that one doesn't often mention in this context, which are Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. I mean, the benefit of having the Saudis on our side when crucial oil supply issues arise, for example, is incredible. When we lost 1.5 million barrels a day of production in Libya, and the Saudis increased by 1.5 million barrels a day their own production a year and a half, 2 years ago, the impact on our economy and the world economy was positive and profound. We want to keep that relationship. The crucial importance of NAVCENT on Bahrain, the headquarters of the Fifth Fleet, is absolutely important. There was a point during the Arab Spring over the last 3 years when the Bahrainis were really talking about whether or not the American commitment to Bahrain and to maintain NAVCENT could be counted on or not. I can't think of anything more alarming than the prospect of not having NAVCENT on Bahrain at some point. So we need to go back to basics and understand that by having the Fifth Fleet there, we are securing the Northern Gulf. We're preventing the domination of the Gulf by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, for God's sake, and the regular Iranian Navy. And this is really we're going to talk about Gulf security. We're going to have to talk about al-Udeid Air Base in Qatar, and we have to talk about the Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. I would focus on maintaining and strengthening those two pillars first. Everything else follows from it.
The ambassador's advocating going back to basics. Ali, do you think it takes a dramatic event in the Middle East for the United States to, you all seem to be saying it's receded, to reestablish its position as the central pillar?
Boy, I certainly hope not. I actually would say that we are not yet in a place where we are receding from the Middle East. I think the long-term trajectory is clearly a rebalance more towards Asia for all the reasons that, we kind of commonly understand. But that's a long-term trajectory. Our strategic interests in the Middle East still remain vital and central. To your question of, what do we need to do to improve the situation? I'll be honest. I think that in recent weeks, the Obama administration has begun to do the basic blocking and tackling at kind of that personal level. The meeting with Mohammed bin Zayed in Europe, the trip to Saudi Arabia a few weeks ago. That's the personal relationship, the kind of restoration, the reset, so to speak, going up that taxonomy, the policy issues, narrowing the differences between ourselves and our Gulf allies about the talks with the P5+1, and giving those assurances that we understand, not only the kind of nuclear game, but also their meddling in the periphery and in the region is also on our radar. Also a reset on our involvement with Syria, which I think has been a little bit underreported in our coordination with our Gulf allies. So we're starting to go up, but at the highest level, it is very much that kind of setting a new strategic frame of elevating our dialogue to, I know it's a little common to say, but really talking at a more strategic and regular level with our Gulf allies, creating that vision for what does fingers crossed, the integration of a peaceful Iran into the Middle Eastern order in the future look like. And those are the kind of highest order things that we will need to do to really reestablish that we have a game plan for the Middle East, not only at a tactical level, but at a strategic level. And then also equipping, last thing, our Gulf allies to do more as part of this regional alliance so that it does free up our resources and our bandwidth to be able to focus more on Asia, as the President was able to do last week.
First of all, I think, maybe I'll start where Ali ended, which is I see improvement. I see improvement and realization that we have to manage this relationship in a much more sustained, much more professional, and a much more, in a way that takes account of their interests. So sending Wendy Sherman to Israel and to Saudi to brief them on the talks, these kind of things are actually important. And I see more awareness of these issues. Yet, there are serious policy differences, and we have to make sure that these policy differences are discussed thoroughly in private in a way that is respectful to the people that we discuss it with, not in the traditional or in the way that's been done so far, which is you have no choice, like it or not, you have to do what we like. We have to take more account of their interests. I think unless the longer that we leave these relationships drift, the more difficult and the more dramatic the need or what we need to do to fix them becomes. Therefore, it's like dealing, I have an 8-year-old. If you do not lay the law in the first time that something goes wrong, you wait a few times, then you have to go into a much higher and a much more dramatic way of reestablishing.
Well, we've all been there, right? Yeah.
We've all been there, and I'm afraid that unless we start fixing this very quickly and dealing with the issues very quickly, we might get to a point where the cost of our getting back in there will be extremely higher. The idea of disengaging from the Middle East maybe strategically makes sense, yet to extricate ourselves from that is not a clean process. It's a long-term process. If we do not manage it well, we will end up paying a price. Our allies will be our traditional allies might end up being motivated to act in ways that might be harmful to us in order for them to actually protect their interest and to remind us that they are still there and they still matter.
John, last word, then we'll open it up for
Yeah,
questions.
I'm less sanguine than these guys are. I think we've dug ourselves a huge, huge hole. I think we are at the point that Ghaith talks about, that to resurrect any degree of credibility and trust and confidence in this region and to actually stall some of these actors from taking some very counterproductive behaviors in Egypt and elsewhere. You're now at a point where you actually have to have a serious demonstration of American power to change an outcome in the region in a way that, on an issue that is important to these countries. And I think this Syria equation has been an absolute disaster for us. It is viewed as an entirely essential issue in this region, and the president's decision to opt out completely of trying to shape an acceptable outcome in Syria that as much as we can get it is in line with U.S. interests and takes account of the various serious interests of our allies, several of whom are actually neighbors of this country and have accepted huge amounts of refugees and are being destabilized as we speak. It's very late in the day now, very hard to do something constructive in Syria, but I think it would either take something like that to show that we're serious about pushing back against the extension of Iranian power in this region and shaping a political outcome in Syria that's more consistent with our interests than with Iran and Russia's interests. Short of that, I think it's going to be very, very hard to rebuild any degree of trust and credibility with any of our allies in the region.
All right, thank you.
I think things will continue to get worse.
All right, so we're going to open it up for questions. Right here in the front. Do I use my microphone, or is there someone in the audience? There's someone? Okay, great. Thank you. Just begin by telling me your name for everyone who's here and who you'd like to direct the question to, please.
This is Dr. Nisar Chowdhury with Pakistan American League. Without American leadership, none of its allies or even the NATO is willing to take any unilateral action until USA get involved and take the lead. That is understandable. My question is that why America is so reluctant to work with the international community or unilaterally to take and make a decision to intervene in Syria? What are those reasons that they believe inaction is better than action? And the other part is for Chana, because he's from FDD and Foundation for Defense of Democracy. When Egypt democracy was really overthrown by the military coup, what this organization, they took the steps or intervened in way to stop that thing, or if they did not, why they did not? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we'll take the second question first, and then I'll give everyone a shot at to intervene or not to intervene in Syria.
The question
That
was,
second
what
question
was
was for-
FDD's position on Egypt, on the coup in Egypt, and whether...
Yes,
Yeah,
this is meant for defense of democracies, and democracy
Right.
collapsed. What steps did they take, or where did they contribute or subscribe to stop that democracy to collapse?
Listen, I'll let other people, like Cliff and Mark, can speak better. I don't think there was an institutional position in FDD. I think this was a very difficult issue to say that democracy collapsed in Egypt long before the July 3rd of 2013. I don't think anything about that Muslim Brotherhood government was consistent with the democratic evolution and democratic path in Egypt. I agree with Bob Kagan that it would, from my perspective, as somebody who supports democracy and civil society and a liberal order in these countries, it would have been far better if we could have waited 3 years and seen that government completely delegitimized in the Muslim Brotherhood throughout Egypt and the entire Middle East, neutered as a primary ideological and political force in that region. But I'm not sitting in Cairo, and the force of 20 or 30 million Egyptian people willing to come out in the streets and to say this organization is a dire threat to our society, is destroying Egypt as we know it, matters to me. It says something to me. Again, I'm not happy with the situation. I think it's very, very difficult now in Egypt. But from speaking for me personally, not institutionally as FDD, it's for me very much the kind of choice we faced 30 or 40 years ago in picking between authoritarian governments and communist governments. At least with the authoritarians, we have got the chance, if we're engaged in using our power and our diplomacy and our leverage, to see some kind of, and have some kind of hope for positive evolution and engagement in those societies. I would say with the Muslim Brotherhood and allowing themselves to consolidate themselves in the largest Arab country where we had real strategic interests, there and in the rest of the Middle East, I would say, is a recipe for disaster for America and disaster for any hope in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years for the kind of positive democratic evolution that people like Bob Kagan wanted. That's my view.
Okay, so Ghaith, we're now going to go to the question of Syria. Why is inaction preferable to action?
I actually am not an expert on the Syria itself, so I can't answer that. But what I can answer is the following. On Syria, there are two things that I think defined and damaged our interests. First of all, we need to have clarity and predictability and trustworthiness. When we have a red line, we enforce the red line. If we don't want to enforce the red line, let's not have a red line. We got to a point when we talked about using force, where we got some of our allies to take forward position on these things. We pulled back, and they were stuck out there in the cold. And that is something that they remember very well, and will get into their calculations next time that we ask them to do something risky. Secondly, the way the decision was made in Washington. I mean, I think if you recall when John Kerry gave his speech, a war speech, a very effective war speech, just to be undermined within hours by decision to pull back, has also created a lot of mistrust among our allies in the credibility of some of our senior officials. And there was a sense that this is a divided administration. So I think as we move forward, there are two things to take into account. Whatever we decide to do, I have no opinions on how to react in Syria, but when we do something, let's do it in a unified way and in a way that our allies can actually trust and feel that they can plan and operate around.
Ali?
Yeah, I'll pick up on the Egypt one. Just want to kind of expand on what John said, because the view here from the United States, it's a difficult one, and he gave as good of a kind of explication of the the kind of the difficult position that we're in, as I've heard. It's interesting. I was right before the presidential elections. I was in a taxi in Cairo, and I got in, and the guy's listening to Quran, and he's got the kind of the hadith from the Quran hanging from the mirror, and I said something to him. I said, well, I guess you're probably supporting Morsi. And he said, absolutely not. I'm voting for Ahmed Shafiq. And I was surprised. I said, why? And he said, because I used to be Muslim Brotherhood, and I know their minds. If you let them in, we will have them there for 20 years. They will disassemble every institution we have to consolidate the power. And isn't it always the taxi driver that has the right beat on things? I mean, that was the most prescient analysis that I've ever heard. So, it's a difficult question. You're watching an administration that is unwinding all the institutions of democracy in the country, or do you take the one that is not going to be democratic at first, but at least promises to have a democratic trajectory? Well, we've sat on our hands a little bit through that question, maybe appropriately so. But I think the big question now is, listen. The current regime in Egypt has enacted a number of measures to ensure stability, a crackdown, on a lot of different fronts that are, contrary to our values and our beliefs, but doing it in the name of stability. After the presidential election, after the parliamentary election, if there is an easing of those, if we see greater freedom of the press, if we see more political inclusion and plurality, I think we can see that the political trajectory is one that we can agree on. What if it doesn't? That's going to be a difficult question, and I think that's kind of the policy question at the moment with Egypt.
So, Ambassador, you have the choice between Syria or Egypt.
I'll take one of each.
Okay.
Really quickly. Let me start with Syria. When I talk to my friends and contacts in the region, they're obviously very upset about the fact that the Assad regime now has the military advantage in Syria, is definitely not falling anytime soon, and therefore presents a scenario in which Iranian interests are winning, in the sense that they're hanging on to their strategic bridgehead in Syria, which gives them access through Lebanon to what they view as the northern front against Israel. And talking about maintaining and strengthening here the Iranian-Hezbollah connection. Imagine a scenario a couple years down the line if Iran gets a nuclear weapon and there's another Hezbollah missile attack on northern Israel. The Israelis want to send in the IAF, the Israeli Air Force, and a nuclear-armed Iran announces at that point that Hezbollah is a crucial interest of the Islamic Republic. Iran is a nuclear power, and the Israelis need to think twice. What does the Israeli Prime Minister do then? I think that's something that bears thinking about. But people also talk more and more about the al-Qaeda threat. And, it was President Masoud Barzani of Kurdistan who said 5 times over the last month or so that the Sykes-Picot agreement has been dissolved and the regional order it created no longer exists. Sykes-Picot, of course, was the 1915 agreement between Britain and France that created the modern boundaries and the modern state system in the Middle East. This is certainly what the Islamic State in Iraq and the Sham, the Levant, thinks. We call it ISIL. In Arabic, they call it Daesh. They're building a state structure that runs from the suburbs of Aleppo to Abu Ghraib near Baghdad. This is a new political entity. They're printing their own money. The Daesh dinars, ISIL dinars, have Osama bin Laden's face on one side and the Twin Towers on the back. So at least you can't accuse these guys of subtlety. Sitting in the region, one of the most serious consequences of Western inaction, not just US, but Western inaction on Syria, is the fact that al-Qaeda now is taking hold through ISIL, the distant al-Qaeda faction, but very much al-Qaeda in terms of their values and practices, horrific practices. They're taking hold of a huge swath of territory, much of Mesopotamia. This is not the Afghan-Pakistan border area. This is on the Mediterranean. And one of the most puzzling things and disheartening things from the point of view of our traditional allies in the region is that apparently nothing is happening on that front. On Egypt, just to echo and reinforce a bit what some of the other panelists said, and to go back to my remark about maintaining basics, a military alliance with whoever governs Egypt is of fundamental importance to our security interests in the region. And so what our friends in the region hope is to see is a revival of the military relationship between the United States and Egypt in the future. It's hard to imagine how one maintains the security of Israel or our basic alliance structure without Egypt in the future. I think everybody sees it that way. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question. Over here, please, I guess the third row.
Mike, you probably know where I'm going to go with this one.
Nice to see you, General.
Nice to see you, Mike. My name is Mark Kimmett. What you've all suggested is that we need to do two things in this conversation. Number one, a visible sign of assurance to our allies in the region, and a visible sign of deterrence to Iran inside the region. Now, John, you remember a number of years ago this notion of perhaps considering a security guarantee for our allies in the region is something that should be considered. As we watch the U.S. putting U.S. troops into our treaty ally countries in Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia over the next couple of years, should we be considering that notion of an explicit security guarantee with our allies in the region for that assurance and deterrence that comes with it, or does it come with more problems than it solves?
I think it comes with lots of problems. I think at the end of the day, a formal security commitment to defend Saudi Arabia under every circumstance is something that is, I'm not sure I would particularly want to do. At the end of the day, I think much more important, we haven't needed one for the better part of 6 decades because we didn't think it served our interests, they didn't think it served their interests, there were understandings between leaders, there was a deep strategic relationship and a sense of common purpose to confront and combat enemies in the region. And the problems we face today is because there's fundamental doubt about that. And if we do not stop the Iranians from becoming either a threshold nuclear weapon state or an actual nuclear weapon state, there is no treaty or commitment in the world that is going to matter to these countries at all. There is going to be a Saudi nuclear bomb, an Egyptian nuclear bomb, a Turkish nuclear bomb. They're not going to rely on the United States. After 3 American presidents have solemnly stood up and told these guys, we are going to stop Iran from getting the bomb. If that is violated, they are never in the world. A security commitment is not going to be your answer to that. You're going to face just an absolutely disastrous, unstable, dangerous world. So rather than thinking in those terms, I would much rather that we focus on the task at hand, which is taking care of business the way we've done it the last 5 or 6 decades, by actually paying attention to the core existential security interests of our key allies in the region that are critical to our standing in the world and critical to the order that we've created.
Okay, thank you for the question. Just behind the general, yeah, in the salmon.
Thank you. My name is Sharon Nariman, and I'm with Human Rights Democracy Iran. And my question is more to Ali, because I feel that I get perception that there is optimism of Iran, U.S. Nuclear talk, that it's improving. And I don't know if it is because of Rouhani, because since Rouhani has come to power in Iran, there are more executions in Iran, even when Ahmadinejad was in power. There are more people in prison. The situation in Iran, dollar has quadrupled. Everything has getting worse and worse. And U.S. has kept quiet in Syria because of Iran, in Iraq right now, allowing Maliki to run. Again, we are quiet. We are closing our eyes because of Iran. Why are we giving momentum to Iran? Iran is a clear danger, not only to its own people, but also in the region. And I don't see where this optimism is coming from and what we think is going to happen once Iran has a nuclear power, especially with the influence that it already has.
Thank you for the question.
No, thank you for that question. I'm incredibly glad that you asked that, because if I've left any impression that I am optimistic about the talks with Iran, then that is a misimpression. I would not at all say that I'm optimistic, which is not to say that I'm deeply pessimistic. I think I'm pragmatic. The reason that I mention that, and I keep talking about this kind of creation of a vision, is because you know, when you have the kind of dislocation, I mean, let's just kind of start with the premise that having one more diplomatic overture following this, clear-eyed, not letting them, you know, play for time, is a sensible step, as opposed to not doing anything or something that's militarily aggressive at the moment. I mean, let's just start with that premise. Let's give this diplomatic overture, the Geneva talks, P5+1 talks, a chance. If you're not going to consult your allies in advance, if you're not going to talk to them that you're about to engage for the first time in decades, their mortal enemy, you shouldn't be terribly surprised when they come back to you as being quite upset and quite puzzled. So the reason that I mention this, creating some type of a vision, is if you can at least work jointly on what a conceptual roadmap, a future vision for what this regional order might look like, and leave it at that, even if it's just at the highest strategic and conversational level. At least when they find out from turning on the TV or reading that morning's New York Times what you're doing, they have something to gauge it against, as opposed to not having had that. And frankly, and I'm sure that Michael has heard this and others have as well, what happened as a result of that was me getting phone calls or having conversations with friends in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi saying, I think we're starting to suspect that you're actually going to cut a deal with Iran so that they can become your policeman, your partner in the region, as opposed to ourselves. Why would they say such a thing? That seems that probably would, I would imagine, would strike most in this audience and most on this stage as being rather unthinkable. It's because not only are we not doing the tactical work, but we're not talking at the most strategic level of where we want this to go. So that's really what I meant when I said that. I'm as realistic and sometimes pessimistic as anybody when it comes to where this is, what kind of fruit this is all going to ultimately bear.
Okay, we have time for one last question. How about right in the back there, please?
Hello, my name is Greg Aftandilian with the Center for National Policy. My question is for Dr. Al-Omari. On this issue of the Russian-Egyptian weapons deals and negotiations, can't we sort of interpret that as part of something in Egyptian domestic politics? Because you raised the point there was a widespread perception the United States was in bed with the Muslim Brotherhood, and now the military wants to show that it can play, it's not beholden to the United States at home. It can play the game on the international scene. But at the end of the day, of course, much of the Egyptian military is so much geared towards the United States, they're not going to really go into the Russian orbit. Thank you.
I mean, maybe to a small extent that is the case, but I don't think that's the main issue. At the end of the day, I mean, Russia is not that popular in Egypt or in the Arab world for that matter. I mean, people see what Russia is doing in Syria, in the Arab world, and they don't look at Russia kind of as the savior, the knight in shining armor, what have you. I think it is more of a message to the United States that we have options. Now, knowing very well They know, and they know that we know that these are not easy options, knowing very well that to go to Russia, you need to have a very costly strategic shift from what you have now to something else. So I think they're using this partly to show that they're independent to their own public, but partly to as some leverage towards us. I don't see much of a domestic reason for that. Maybe it's a small component of the populism that you see from the army, but that's not the defining issue in my view. Right now, the main issue when it comes to populism is the issue of Muslim Brotherhood. I think this is the one that's defining it, and this is the one where I think they are going to be unmovable. And this is one thing that we have to kind of take into account as we start rebuilding our relation with the Egyptians, that this is one issue, we might not like it, we might have issues with it, yet this is one where they feel it's a matter of life and death, not only for them, but in a regional context, and they will not move on it. But on the security and on the Russian issue, I think this is just simply a warning to us, one that is very surface level. The concern is, if we continue withholding military aid for a long time, and they get to a point where they have no spare parts, they have none of these issues, then the other options, whether it is Russia or what have you, become more appealing. We're not at that point yet, and I don't think we are going to get to that point. We realize that there's a problem, but this is where I see the crunch moment.